Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Fifth Dimension Live Video Podcast. I'm one of your co hosts, Matthew J. Haas, and with me, my partner, Mr. Dave Schumacher. Dave, what's going on, buddy?
Whole lot of travel for work, but besides that, just glad to be back with another episode of the Fifth Dimension. So, hello everybody, welcome from lovely, snowy, cold Illinois, and looking forward to an exciting night. We got a great guest, and can't wait to introduce him.
Yeah. Before we give the grand, big red carpet introduction for our guest, which I can't wait, really excited to have him. We're going to be talking about a lot of good things tonight. Want to just let our listeners and our viewers know that if you're interested in chatting with us during the show, there are ways. We have a chat room next to the live video feed on YouTube. During our YouTube channel live video feed, there's a little section that's a chat room. Not fancy. If you have a Gmail account, Google account, or YouTube account, you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel by hitting the red bell in the top right corner. You can do that way and also participate in the chat that way. Again, it's not fancy, but my motto: if it's free, it's for me. So it's pretty simple. You can ask questions during the show. You can either ask us questions, our guest questions, and I'll relay the questions to him through the chat room. You can ask us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page. It's the Fifth Dimension Radio Show on Facebook. If you have no means of getting on Google or Gmail and you're on Facebook, everybody's on Facebook these days. I mean, geez. So, feel free, give us questions, on our Facebook page. So I'm excited to have our guest. Gonna go ahead and roll out the red carpet there. Dave, it's your opening statement for tonight's episode number 6 with Mr. Mike Nichols. Give your big introduction.
Well, I don't have an opening statement, but I am going to go through Mike's bio. So what Mike sent us is looking back over his 66 years. Mike can't remember a time when he really wasn't interested in parapsychology. So he's had a lifelong interest in it. His first national publication on the subject was in 1966. And that's when he was in 8th grade. So this guy was serious about it all the way back into the 8th grade. It was a letter that was published in Fate magazine asking about electronic equipment for haunting investigations. The letter was answered by Dr. Stevenson, who some of us might know from the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies. He does a lot of reincarnation research back in the day. So Dr. Stevenson directed Mike to a paper on the topic published in the Journal of the American Society of Psychical Research by Charles Tart. So Mike immediately joined the society, the American Society of Psychical Research, and he began reading peer-reviewed journals throughout high school. In college, he received his bachelor's with a double major in communications and psychology with a concentration in parapsychology from the University of Missouri at Columbia. He became a research assistant to Kansas City parapsychologist Robert Ashby, contributing a chapter on the investigation of hauntings in Ashby's high school textbook on parapsychology. Through Bob, Mike met a lot of luminaries in the field, such as J.B. Rhine. Mike continued to lecture on parapsychology in his post-grad years, culminating in teaching a graduate-level course in parapsychology at the University of Missouri at Kansas City during the 1980s. Recently, Mike has returned to field investigation using a random number generator as a tool in the investigation of hauntings. So with that, I'd like to welcome Mike to the show. And how you doing, Mike?
I'm great. Thanks, Dave, for having me on. And thank you, Matt. I've been looking forward to this.
We have as well.
Yeah.
The first thing I have to do is apologize for my voice tonight because I've been fighting a head cold all week long. And so this is not my normal voice. I don't know how different it is, but
well,
that's mine.
That's I want to let our listeners know that's why we only have video for him tonight. We don't see him, blowing his nose on video.
Really, all the tissues around my desk.
We don't want to see his nose running away on screen, or
So that's right.
Mike and I kind of started talking a while back about his work with random event generators, random number generators, and the work that he was doing with them in supposedly haunted locations. But before we dive into that, Mike, can you give us a little bit more history on your background and kind of what you've been up to lately?
Oh gosh. Well, of course, most of the work that I've been doing with random number generators and haunted houses has been carried out with a group also from Illinois called the Psychic Research Institute. I'm sorry, Paranormal Research Institute (PRI), and there are a lot of members in the group, of course, but the three that have been with me this whole way has been the group leader, Dan Williams, and Scott Hibbs, and Brandy Bryan. And so I want to give a shout out to them if they're listening, because without them, this certainly would not have been possible. I met them and started working with them back last summer during the KC Paracon, or Kansas City Paranormal Conference. And I was invited to be a lecturer at that event. And when Dan Williams got up and started talking about the PRI and the fact that his group was trying to approach paranormal investigations in a more scientific way, well, my ears immediately perked up, because that was what I was interested in doing too. And I had told Jason, the fellow who, and Brandon, Jason was the fellow who organized KC Paracon, that if I were ever to get back into field research again, it would probably be to work with a random number generator. And in order to do that, I had to have people working with me who were logging events that happened during the investigation in a very systematic way, which we'll get into the details of that as we talk. But when I found out they were doing that, I started talking with Dan, and we have since conducted two what I would consider fairly successful investigations, again, along a more scientific line than most people are doing these days. So that's what I've been up to.
Great. If you don't mind, Mike, I've been wanting to ask you a question since getting ready to have you on our show. What are some ways, since I know Dave and you have worked together a little bit, and Dave is really into random number generators and whatnot. I'm not that familiar with them. Um I don't have a good background on random number generators. I've seen Dave work with them and we've done a project together, but for those who are interested in learning more about it and how they can use it in the field, what are some uses of random number generators and ways that people can use them in the field?
Well, they actually have quite a long history in the field of parapsychology, because in the early days, when J.B. Ryan was still conducting Zener card tests at Duke University, one of the things that they had to do was be able to randomize their targets. And in any ESP kind of test, like if you were doing a Zener card test, for example, you always have certain elements in any given test. You've got the experimenter, the person who is conducting the experiment. You've got the subject, the person who's trying to guess the Zener cards, which cards are coming up. You've got the cards themselves, or they may not be cards, they may be pictures or other things. We usually refer to that as the target. And then you have a barrier, something that would keep the subject from knowing what the target is through any normal sensory means, the normal five senses, in other words, because what we're looking for is extrasensory perception. So, when Ryan first started publishing, all of these aspects were critiqued by the skeptics at one level or another. The experimental controls weren't tight enough, so they tightened them and so forth. And one of the things that came in for criticism was whether the Zener card deck was sufficiently randomized, because it wouldn't be enough just for somebody to shuffle the deck once and say, okay, start guessing cards. So what they started to do was, I think the first thing they started to do was use mechanical card shufflers of the kind they used to use in Las Vegas for gambling. And well, no, that wasn't random enough. So then they started using these big books of published random numbers and assigning numbers from those to the cards. Well, no, that wasn't random enough still. So then they started using elaborate random entry points into the books of random numbers. And well, no, that wasn't random enough still. So finally, through the work of a physicist working at the Boeing research labs, a fellow named Helmut Schmidt, he created a random number generator that was based on the decay of a subatomic particle called strontium-90. And that's one of the most truly random processes we know in the universe. As this breaks down, it would basically, every time one of the subatomic particles hit their counter, would stop it, and the counter would be constantly going at a 1 2 1 2 1 2 a million times a second, or whether actually 0 1 0 1. And whenever one of these particles was emitted, it would stop the counter in either the 0 or the 1 position, and that would determine which direction a light on a panel would move. And so the subject in these experiments would, if it was a precognition test, for example, they would try to predict which way the light would move around in this circle of lights. And if it was a PK experiment, psychokinesis, the subject would try to exert a kind of mind over matter and see if they could make the light move in a particular direction. So that's how far back. And I don't know, Dave, do you know if they go any further back than that?
That's probably as far back as they went with random number generation. And before they did that, I think to run certain experiments looking at PK, they used dice.
Oh,
and
of
just
course.
rolling the dice. But before that, I don't think they really did much with random number generators until Helmut Schmidt got involved and developed the system and the protocols.
Right. Did that answer your question, Matt?
Yeah, no, totally.
Yeah. The one thing that's interesting is, that it's been used quite a bit, as Mike noted, in the parapsychology lab. But more recently, you go back and, has it been used in haunted locations before? Well, obviously, yes, because Mike's doing it. And his approach is unique compared to what everybody else has been doing, which I thought is fascinating. But, you go back into, and I'm trying to find the date on this, 1992 by Maher and Hansen, George Hansen. And
who was once a student of mine, actually.
Yep. And I've, corresponded with George a few times, and, they ran a random number generator at a couple locations that they investigated. And one of them, it was trending towards having non-randomness, and another location they did, it didn't. Also, these things have been run in a psychiatrist's office looking for responses to different types of emotions. And then if you get into Dr. Joey Caswell's work, where he took the Celeron field REG system, which is the same one I use, he was looking at a variety of different locations, including supposedly haunted locations and other areas where you would have what he termed positive and negative emotional valences. And he was trying to see if there was a difference in the trend. Does it trend up or does it trend down, depending on the supposed emotional valence of these locations? So, the history in parapsychology is pretty solid, but as far as doing it in haunted locations, that's pretty recent, with both what Hansen had done in the 90s, and then Caswell, and now Mike, and then some of the work our group had done in the past too. So it's still pretty in its infancy, but what Mike's doing, I think you're gonna find out, is really fascinating. It's a novel approach. It's very precise and detail oriented, and that's what I like about it.
Right. Cool.
So I guess the question is, do we want to just jump into what Mike's been doing? Because that's the money part of this. We want to know.
That's the money part.
Well, I can certainly do that. I guess I want to kind of talk a little bit about the scientific method too, because I've always been a big supporter of that, and it's been said that the scientific method has essentially 5 steps to it. First, you make observations, then you set a question that you want to answer, then you come up with a hypothesis for that, you test it, and you evaluate it, and then repeat, repeat, repeat. So I have to start. I think my step one observation was the fact that I had seen the random number generator used in what was called the Global Consciousness Project, and we haven't talked about that yet. But that was a project that was under the direction of Roger Nelson at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, or PAIR laboratories. And the idea was to set up random event generators all over the globe, typically in university settings, and have them running all the time, 24/7, and monitored all the time. And what we really haven't said yet is what a random number generator does is it just sits there doing what its name implies. It cranks out a constant stream of random numbers. And the randomness can be based on different things, but at any rate, there are mathematical tests that can then be used to monitor the output of the RNG and to see if what it's putting out, what it's pumping out, is actually random or not. And their idea was that their question was, would something that happened on the world stage, something very big, cause or at least have a correlation with all the random number generators going off the beam, and suddenly they would be in an anomalous territory where the numbers they were generating were no longer random. You could see actual patterns in them and so forth. So that's what they did. And of course, they got hits with that on things like when the O.J. Simpson trial was going on, at the very moment when they announced the verdict of that.
Really?
Oh yeah, when Princess Diana was killed, when people were all over the world were watching her funeral, they noticed a kind of coherence, and I think they the tendency was to want to attribute it to the fact that so many people were all mentally focused on one thing, that instead of the normal chaotic random thoughts that people had, suddenly all their thoughts were converging. I mean, this is talking about a possible mechanism behind it, and we're not really quite there yet because we can't explain that. But almost as if to confirm that, their biggest success, if you want to call it a success, happened during the 9/11 event, and that's when they got their most extreme value of if you like see it on a graph, you'll just be amazed at how it spikes. But the other thing that amazes you is that spike started occurring about 3 hours before the first plane hit the first tower.
Really? Wow.
So what does that say exactly? Is that speaking to the fact that the event was already starting to happen, things were already in motion, and somehow the random number generators were picking up on that? You can't see me using finger quotes, but I'm going to have to do that a lot tonight.
Was it possibly making a prediction?
Or was it maybe the people who were, eventually became aware of what was happening? I mean, because when it happened, the whole world was watching. But we know that people have precognition. So maybe a lot of these people at a subliminal level, at a totally subconscious level, knew that something, catastrophic was about to happen on the world stage.
Right.
And it already started affecting the random number generators 3 hours before that. So I guess that was my quote, step one of the scientific method. That was my observation. And so the step two, the question that I had was, okay, if this works on a global level, could it possibly work on a very local level? What if I were to bring a random number generator into a so-called haunted house? Would it then kind of follow the pattern that was established in the Global Consciousness Project? Would it start giving me anomalous readings whenever something paranormal happened in the haunted house? And so when Dave referred to my quote unique approach to this, I think that's what he's referring to. Yes, is that right, Dave?
Yeah. And to clarify a little bit, I mean, we've run random number generators at haunted locations. Others have, but what Mike is doing is trying to correlate an individual bit or run to another experience or equipment reading at these locations, which is incredibly unique.
What I did was basically the random number generator that I am using is essentially like an electronic coin flipper, and it goes through and it flips 100 coins at, you know, or there are 100 coin tosses at a time.
Hmm.
So Matt, if I was to ask you to take a coin and flip it 100 times, and I would ask you to guess how many times would that coin come up heads, what would you say?
Right.
Out of 100 times?
I would say at least half.
About 50 times, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if it came up heads 55 times, would that make you start wondering whether that was a fair coin or not?
Right. I see what you're saying. Right.
Or 60 times
Yeah.
maybe. Or in my case, I had to pick a threshold to you know, so that I could see where my, you know, just how anomalous the readings were getting on my RNG. So I rather arbitrarily on the first occasion, I did a pilot study at last year's KC Paracon when we went to the Kearney Harris house here in Kansas City.
Cool.
And I arbitrarily picked anything over 65. So in other words, either 66 heads or 66 tails in a run of,
Mike, what Z score does that usually come up to? Is it?
you know, I don't.
I know it's excess of
I know
probably two.
I can give you the two-tailed.
No, that's fine. That's okay. It's highly significant though. If you're looking
Well,
at
yeah, the p value on it would be 0.000458,
Yep.
which is about one time in 2,183 times. Would you get a coin flip that breaks that threshold? And of course, if you get 67, that's an even higher p-value. If you get 68, right, that's even higher. So and I say it was kind of an arbitrary pick for me. And the first time I went in on the pilot study, I was wondering if I maybe had set it too high, because it went for over an hour, I think, or very close to an hour before I got the first anomalous reading. And this actually runs on my smartphone. So the smartphone has a sensor which can access atmospheric noise, and that's what it uses as its numerical values. So I thought, gosh, maybe I've set the threshold too high, because I've been here an hour and I've only gotten one. And only at the end of the first hour did I get my first beep or my first hit from the RNG. And it was close to an hour before I got the second one. And then I got almost three in a row, very much toward the end of the investigation, at the end of the third hour. And all three of those seemed to me to correspond to something else that had happened that was paranormal in the house at the same time. So that meant that out of the about a 3-hour investigation on that one, I got about 5 hits total. And I thought, well, you know, that seems about a good rate to me, because obviously I don't want to set the threshold so low that I'm getting, you know, hit after hit after hit, you know, 5 or 6 hits an hour. I didn't want something like that. And I didn't want to set the threshold so high that I would get, you know, only maybe one hit out of a whole night's investigation of 6 or 7 hours. So this seemed about right to me. And then when we ended up doing the 2 investigations, when I was a part of PRI at the Beatty Mansion in St. Joseph, Missouri, and again in the Garnett House in Garnett, Kansas, we actually got quite a few more than just 5 events in 3 hours. So, and we can get into the statistics as we go into that.
I got a question for both of you guys, actually.
Sure. Okay. Then I get one too.
Yeah, no problem. Now, again, like the random event generators, this typical thing is a little bit out of my realm a little bit. I know I've worked on a project with Dave, but I'm kind of assuming. I don't like to assume a lot on a lot of stuff, but we know what happens when you assume. It gets you in a lot of trouble. Um,
It
but
makes you spout weird cliches too.
yeah, exactly. But when you do these projects at these locations where you set up your random number generator, I'm kind of guessing you do a base like reading first to make sure that like you have your like logical things out of the way, like kind of how we do our base readings with other equipment. Like how do you gather your base information before you say, these odd numbers are starting to jump at you that stand
Well,
out that or something.
yeah, I don't actually try to do a base reading at the haunted location. What I've done to test my RNG for a base level reading is just to run it when I'm at home. And when I'm doing that, I very seldom get more than a couple of hits within an hour, and
Mhm.
usually not even that. So when I get to the haunted house, the interesting that I'm doing thing that I'm doing here and the way I'm evaluating it, which is again a difference, I think, in the way a lot of people do their RNG work,
Mhm.
is the coin is flipped 100 times, and then it's basically I reset to the base level. I start another run of 100 flips.
And
Okay.
it's important because Mike's recording then every one of those resets. What most people do they take a cumulative deviation. Now it's an independent, it's a new flip every time, but they're adding the deviation to the number before it. So
Right.
it's a
Right.
cumulative deviation, which is a huge difference compared to what Mike's doing, which is a really important point.
Mhm.
And I'm going to go I want to ask my question, Mike. When you talk
Sure.
about what's considered a significant event, you already explained the p-value you're looking for, but what is considered a significant event or a subjective paranormal experience or an equipment reading? I mean, what is that and how is that determined?
Well, that is, of course, an extremely important question, and it's something that you and I discussed when we were first starting that. Because when I first approached you about this, as you'll remember, Dave, the big question, or the kind of feedback that I got from both you and from Brian Williams was, well, I don't think you'll have any problem, deciding what's an anomalous event with your RNG, Mike, but what you're going to have a problem with is defining or operationally defining what is an external paranormal event, something that your researchers, report, for example. For example, is it enough to say that if a researcher walks into a room and they suddenly feel all the hairs on their left arm stand up, is that do I log that as a paranormal event? Or as Brandy said, I'm always fond of this quote. She said, "If one of the hairs in my right eyebrow moves, is that a paranormal event?" And both
Subjective
uh,
sometimes. That's the
yeah,
problem.
it's very subjective, and both Brian and Dave pointed that out to me, and they said, "I think that's where you're going to have problems, Mike."
Yeah, why is it when your hair stands up, your eyebrows don't stand out?
Yeah, and so anyway, I was to tell you the truth, I was a little bit discouraged about that, and I thought, well, maybe this is going to remain in the realm of pseudoscience after all, unless I can operationally define a paranormal event. And I kind of struggled with that question for at least a week, and then I kind of had an epiphany, and I wrote Dave back and I said, as I look, we created these detailed spreadsheets for each of our investigations, and the spreadsheets are in 1 minute increments, and most of those lines on the spreadsheet are blank. Then there are the lines that show where the RNG hit, and then there are the lines that show when somebody reported a paranormal event. And I thought, I don't really think I do need to operationally to define a paranormal event. I think it will be enough if we look at the lines in the spreadsheet and say, did an RNG event occur next to any other reported event? at a level of probability that is statistically significant. And to me, that was my epiphany. That was the breakthrough.
Yeah, and it's really important that, as we're sitting here listening, and Jen said it too, is to record everything.
Oh
Because
yeah.
you don't know what may or may not be a paranormal event. And the interesting thing is, honestly, when I started looking at this with you, and I thought,
I love this.
People are going about their investigation, they're noting things, Mike's writing down the hits on the RNG. I'm like, well, by random chance, there's got to be some overlap, but I'm not going to steal his thunder, but I was really surprised by what we found.
Right. Well, I had to decide first. Another thing I had to decide, not only the threshold of the RNG, but I also had to decide the time interval that was involved. And once again, I rather arbitrarily picked a 3-minute time interval, so that if an RNG hit happened within 3 minutes, either way, of a paranormal event hit, and by the way, that when I say an external paranormal event, I'm not just talking about a subjective experience from one of the researchers, but it might also be a ping from one of our other instruments. An EMF meter may trigger, or a REM pod, or what, I don't even know what some of these things are. But if they spike within a 3-minute distance from the RNG, or time increment from the RNG, then we went ahead and logged that as an event. So we in doing, I collected the raw data, and in the Beatty Mansion, I'll go ahead and get into this now, if that's okay, unless you have any other preliminary questions.
I have one more actually before we do get into that. Does any of our paranormal equipment interfere with your random number generators? Would they interfere at all, or?
Well, theoretically, I mean, if somebody like keyed a radio or something, it could theoretically interfere with the electronics of the smartphone.
Right.
I think that's a possibility, but I can't imagine a way in which it would interfere, which would cause a pattern or an anomaly in accessing the random number data, which is being generated by the atmospheric noise. So I don't think it could make any difference in the stream of random numbers that the RNG is outputting.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah, and the two things I've heard about is electromagnetic fields, depending on the type of RNG that you're using. If it's not shielded properly, sometimes electromagnetic fields could affect the output, and that's one of the reasons why we actually we tested those and analyzed that in one of the papers we did, because we had some high EMF spikes at the time that we had some, non-random output, but we didn't find any correlation there. The other thing, Persinger's group has come across is that photons may be able to affect them as well, but that's a whole nother discussion. So there's not a lot that seems to influence them as far as the equipment, though.
Yeah, we don't wear photon packs on investigations yet.
Right.
We'll be a whole nother discussion.
It'll be a while before we get to that. So anyway, I said, knowing that in the Global Consciousness Project, that their RNG started reacting 3 hours before the event that they seemed correlated to, I thought, well, 3 hours seems a little perhaps broad for a local investigation like a haunting, which only may last 6 hours, say, if we do a typical night's investigation. So I said, well, let's be very conservative here. Let's say that it has to happen within 3 minutes of the RNG. So when we did our first investigation, this was back last September. It was early September, September 8th of 2018. We went to the Beatty Mansion in St. Joseph, Missouri, myself and the other members of PRI that I've mentioned. And we also had, that was a multiple investigation unit. We also had Tammy and Jim from EVP here in Kansas City, and also Laura, Justin, and Tiffany joined us. So we had a number of people who were also helping report their paranormal experiences back to us. And one of the members of our group, Brandy Bryan, her job is to basically sit at the command post and log everything that happens, no matter what it is and what's reported, whether it's something from one of the other pieces of equipment, or whether it's merely a feeling or something somebody saw or an object movement. She logs that. And then we put that down on our spreadsheet and we look at it in terms of how close it was to an RNG anomalous reading. And in the case of the Beatty Mansion, just from the raw data, I had a strong feeling that we were onto something, because during the about 6.5 hour investigation at the Beatty Mansion, we had 19 anomalous readings from the RNG. And out of that 19, 12 of them, or 63% of them, occurred within 3 minutes of one or more paranormal events. And so that was the data that I sent to Dave to do an analysis of, because I thought from the raw data we were looking pretty good, but it had been too long since I had done this kind of statistical evaluation to test for the independence between the two variables, the RNG hit and the paranormal hit. And so I could probably hand it over to Dave at this point to let him explain what he did.
Yeah, so the one thing you have to remember is that you're going to have situations where you have an RNG hit and let's say an external event hit. You're going to have situations where you have an RNG hit, no external event. Then you'll have an external event and no RNG hit, and then you'll have negative on all of them. So that makes a big difference, because if you're only looking at it saying, okay, I'm just writing down when the hits are, you have to take into account those 3 other scenarios.
So what Dave is saying is there are basically 4 different conditions that can happen, but the one we're interested in is where there's an RNG event and a paranormal event occurring together.
Right.
But because those other things can happen, and they can happen by chance, that means when you get an RNG hit and an external event hit at the same time, that could just be chance, because all these things are happening. So what you do is construct a 2x2 contingency table, and you do a chi-square test for association. So what you do is you crank these through that analysis, and you pick a significance level, and it spits out a number, and it tells you either you accept or reject the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis would be there is no association between these RNG hits and anything else somebody is experiencing or any other equipment hit. And the rejecting the null hypothesis and accepting an alternate hypothesis is that there is an association between when there is a hit on the RNG and people have an experience, or there's another piece of equipment that picks up something as well. So I will leave it there and let Mike take it from that point.
Okay. And I've got to say, I just loved it when I first explained this to Dave, and when he actually told me after the fact that when he first heard me talk about it, he thought, this is really not going to yield anything important. So what happened was,
not with Dave.
No, not with Dave. We ended up, he ran the chi-square test and got a chi-square value of 29.187, which evaluated, I guess we should talk about statistical significance first. In most areas of science, something that's statistically significant would have a p-value of 0.05, which means that that result would happen by chance in only 1 out of 20 times, basically, or 5% of times that you ran it. So that is considered statistically significant in a lot of areas of science. In parapsychology, they set the bar a little higher typically and put it at a p-value of 0.01. Now, obviously, the lower the p-value, the more statistically significant it is, your results. So when Dave completed his analysis, he reported back to me that he found that we had that chi-score I mentioned, which evaluated to a p-value of less than 0.00001.
Interesting.
Let that sink in for a second. That means that would have happened. We would have gotten results like that by chance only one time in 100,000 times by
Wow.
chance.
Yeah.
That's considered extremely statistically significant. And I think it's
Wow.
fair to say that it kind of blew Dave away a little bit.
I, you know, obviously you think about it, it's like, okay, I was maybe somewhat biased because it was all about cumulative deviation. You're letting this thing run. You're collecting the data as a whole, as a session, and to even think about individual RNG runs, hits. You look at it and think, well, of course people are going to experience something, and of course there's going to be some random number generator hits. So it's like, yeah, there might be a chance association here, and that's it. But
Yeah,
when
it may just be due to
surprised.
coincidence, in other words, right?
Yeah, it could just be nothing but coincidence. But when I ran it, and I'll be honest with you, Mike, and I think I've told you this, I didn't expect to find anything.
Right.
And when I did, I'm like, ooh, okay. Well, that's interesting. So, you know, one of the things I want to ask is, you know, you talk about it was Brandy's job, right? She records everything.
Right.
That's really, really important because the detail that you're working with the 3 minutes and trying to get everything recorded, how does that work? How are they getting her the information? How is that being communicated? How is she writing it down?
Typically,
how does she stare at all those numbers without going crazy?
you know, she actually likes these numbers. She said over and over she likes working with the statistics, and thank God she does, because I mean, that is what makes this kind of approach possible.
Do they walkie it into her, Mike, or do they?
No.
After the fact, how do they do?
Typically, everybody on the team has a walkie-talkie or radio, and they just, you know, when something happens that's paranormal, whether it's something they see on one of their meters, or whether it's an object they see move, or whether it's a scream they hear in the case of the Beatty Mansion investigation, they'll just key their radio and report back to the command post. We just heard a scream, or my EMF meter just spiked at so forth, whatever, or I just got something on my FLIR or whatever. And she writes that down and she timestamps it. That's the critical thing. Everything is time-stamped down to the minute.
So I guess the one thing have you ever had a situation, not a criticism, just a question. So if somebody keys their two-way radio, does anybody else come back afterwards and say they've had a hit on their EMF meter?
You know, that's a good question, and something I have not looked at. And I will go back through the data and look at that, because that's a very, very good question.
And Matt knows when we were at the place with him, we specifically saw that if cell phones weren't turned off and somebody used a two-way radio, it hit on the equipment.
Right.
Right.
So anyway, that's just a question. I was curious about that.
That's a very good question, and I think it's well worth going. And see, this is the thing. Our team, PRI, is Dan Williams. He's our group leader, and he is absolutely insistent upon this. And I'm so thankful that he is. He insists on complete transparency. All the data that we collected, right down to the photographs of the original handwritten logs that Brandy keeps, are all available for anybody who wants to review it.
That's awesome. I wish more people would do that. That's just great to have that transparency.
Yeah,
yes,
we are that all the time. Nobody shares anything these days.
Yeah, we share everything. We insist on it. So, yeah, that's something we definitely need to look at. Good question. So, yeah, that was our first experience with this. And then we later, you know, I was really felt under the gun, because then I thought, okay, this is such an incredible result. Can we do it a second time? So we got our chance to investigate the second time at the Garnett House in Garnett, Kansas. And in addition to the PRI team, we also had other researchers, Lisa, Peggy, Jason, Larry, other people who were not a member of the PRI team, but were working with us and reporting back to us. It was really funny the way they kind of, once they saw what we were doing, they were like, oh, this is cool. And they were in some cases where they didn't have radios, they would actually run back to the command post to report what had just happened, because they were aware that we needed everything that happened to them. So once again, I collected the data, and we had I think that was about a 7-hour investigation. And during the course of that investigation, we had 18 anomalous probability events on the RNG, 14 of which occurred within 3 minutes of one or more external paranormal events. So, or in other words, 77%. So once again, I thought, I think this looks awfully good, but it wasn't until I handed the data off to Dave that we did
Right.
that he did the chi-square evaluation. So
I would just like to add further to that. I would also like to think it would be extremely important not only to analyze every single piece of data that you were doing with the random event generator, but to review every piece of evidence that you're doing during an entire investigation to see if anything correlates with what you're doing.
oh, absolutely. And the PRI does something called, as most paranormal investigators do, they do something called a post-investigation evidence review, where they go back through hours and hours and hours of audio tape and video to see if there's anything they missed.
Right.
So, and that's another thing. Since we've got the logs, if they miss something, they know what the timestamp is on that from their equipment, and they can see whether that corresponds to an RNG hit or not.
Right.
So anyway, get mindful of the time. Getting to the Garnet results, we when I submitted it to Dave and he ran the same kind of chi-square test for the independence of the variables, he came back with a chi-square score of 15.54, which turned into a p-value of 0.00008.
Wow.
81, which meant that, again, that roughly this kind of result, or this kind of pairing between the RNG hit and the paranormal hit, would have happened by chance only 8 times out of 100,000 times by chance.
Not too bad.
Not too bad. Not too shabby.
No.
So I was elated that we did this not only once, but we did it twice, and that the scores in both cases were regarded by the online calculators that we use as extremely statistically significant.
Right.
So I've got to mention that we don't, this doesn't prove there is a quote ghost. This doesn't really, and this certainly doesn't prove cause and effect. We're not saying that a ghost is causing the RNG to do this. The most we can assert is that there is a correlation between the two of them. There is something that links these things together so that they pair up together, they co-vary together. And that, to me, as Dan would say, it's baby steps, but it's a damn fine baby step, in my opinion, and it's a fairly, as the evaluation says, it's an extremely significant one. Yeah. So I'm over the moon. In fact, when I told Dave about this when I first got his reply to me on Facebook about the evaluation of the Beatty mansion, I was so excited about it that when I first tried to talk to somebody else about it and tell them what had happened, even though I wasn't talking about having seen a ghost or anything like that, nothing visceral, it was just numbers. And yet I was so excited that I choked up. I literally, and this is from somebody who spent half a lifetime in radio broadcasting, I couldn't get it out. I couldn't even say the words. I was so excited.
It's really great. It's impressive. It's something else, because we're taking the individual events and correlating with the hits on the random number generator. That just hasn't been done before, and to see it working is really interesting. So yeah, I mean, they've looked at sessions, entire sessions, but looking at individual hits. Other people have looked at, do EMF hits relate to experiences? Do radiation? Do other things relate to it? But to take these individual hits, I mean, doing the 100 coin flips and seeing if it correlates to what people are experiencing or another hit on the equipment. It's pretty interesting. It's a new level of detail that nobody else has done yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like to think we're kind of breaking new ground with this, and that's what makes me so excited. And of course, I'm very aware that, as in all science, this has to be replicated again and again by not only our own team, but by other teams that are following the same protocols. So
Sure.
I can't wait to enlist the help of others who might be interested in doing this as well.
Right. Well, that's a
So,
good. That's a good segue to my question, actually, because I was going to say, if there are people who are interested in doing random event generators in the field, similar to what you guys are doing, what would you suggest to people? How would they start out? What kind of sensors would you recommend? What kind of, statistics? What
Well,
what would
I
you
yeah, I
what
would
would you
say I would say contact me or the PRI, which they have the Paranormal Research Institute, which they have their own website. You can I'm at this point, I think you can contact Dave just as easily because he understands what we're doing and how we're doing it. So I think either of us could probably fill somebody in on how to approach this. And as far as the original data sheets, the spreadsheets that we have created, the analyses that we have run and how we've done it, all of that we can send as well. Those are all on electronic files, so we can just send them off to anybody who's interested.
Cool.
so Mike, one question. You before we got on the air, you teased that you've done a little different or more analysis. What might that be?
I wanted to have something to surprise Dave with. So, yeah, I started. Dave brought up a question early on, I think right after the Beatty investigation was complete, and he said, "Well, how do we know that maybe if people are reporting their events on the radio, and if you are reporting the RNG hits on the radios to the researchers, how do we know that the researchers might not hear me say, oh, I key my radio and say, oh, there has been an RNG event. And maybe right after that, they suddenly report a paranormal event. Might it not be
Yeah.
that they're, to be at its most charitable, that one of our researchers might be suggestible and might, knowing that there has just been an RNG hit, might think, ooh, things have gone strange in the house right now. There may be something, and they may imagine or hallucinate that they see something paranormal, which isn't really there. That's the most charitable approach to say that. A non-charitable approach would say that one of our researchers would hear me say on the radio, oh, there's an RNG hit, and then they, in order to help our quote help our statistics, might invent or create a paranormal event and report it back just after the RNG hit. Now, I've got to say right here, on a personal level, I know these researchers, and I don't think any of them would consciously cheat. But we have to admit that this is a plausible scenario, and that's certainly something the skeptics are going to bring up, because skeptics like to skeptic. And so we have to answer
Don't get
that.
me started.
Right. So what I did, Dave, was I went back over the spreadsheets, and well, one of the things when we were talking about this, I said, no, there are at least two types of these pairings that wouldn't really be up for that, or wouldn't be vulnerable to that kind of criticism. One would be if the RNG happened just after the paranormal event, because the person wouldn't be suggestible in that case. The other is if it's something objective that happened, like it was an actual hit on one of the meters, with the EMF meter, or one of the other meters suddenly went off in another part of the house, or a camera recorded something, or an audio recorder recorded something, or there was an object movement. But something that is not merely subjective would also be not be vulnerable to this criticism. So just for fun, I went back through the spreadsheets, both the Beatty spreadsheet and the Garnett House spreadsheet, and looked at every single RNG hit to see how many of the positives we got. In other words, I wanted to make sure I eliminated any possible false positives, to see how many of the RNG hits relied totally on the subjective report of one of our researchers. And it turns out, this is very interesting, because these paranormal events tended to cluster in many cases, or because they were based more on an equipment hit than a personal report hit. In the Beatty Mansion, there was only one such event from the RNG where the correlation rested solely upon the report of one of our researchers, a subjective report that followed the RNG. So I diligently subtracted one from the A cell in that 2x2 table you were talking about, and I added one to the D cell, which is, yes, we had an RNG hit, but we're not going to count the researcher's subjective report on this one. And I came up with an adjusted chi-value and p-value score, or chi-score and p-value. And the adjusted score in the Beatty Mansion, it was originally 29.187. It went to 24.564. The p-value did not change. That change in the chi-square was so small that the p-value remained at less than 0.00001. So even eliminating the possible
the subjective part, right?
Pardon? Say again, Dave?
So you eliminated the subjective, or the people versus the technology, essentially?
Yes, that's essentially what I did. If any RNG rested solely on a subjective report of one of our researchers, I eliminated it.
Okay, thanks.
And I did the same thing in the Garnett House. And there we took a slightly bigger hit. Instead of one elimination, there were two, which changed the original chi-square score of 15.54 to an adjusted score of 9.38, which gave us a p-value of 0.002194, which it told me was still very statistically significant. So in both cases, I eliminated what skeptics would say, oh, you might have, this false positive here because your researchers might be responding to the report of the RNG.
That's
just got rid of those and looked at the data the other way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way to kind of do almost like a sensitivity analysis, pull out the subjective stuff. But I mean, really, the chi-square analysis itself with the 2x2 contingency table does account for a lot of those things, but you took the ultra conservative approach and pulled that out, which is important.
Right.
So I guess the question is, how much, and this has been debated in random number generator work, what's affecting it? That's the first question, which we do not know. And the second question is, how do we know it's not the researcher themselves hoping for a positive response and getting that? And that's always bugged me about the stuff I've done as well.
Well, I think we don't know that there's no way we can, I don't think there's any way to experimentally eliminate that possibility. And it's typically called the experimenter effect, as you know.
Yep.
And I think that will always be a theoretical alternative to what we're seeing. But
not a criticism. It's just something
it's
every
not
time you talk about random number generator.
Yeah, and the reason it's there is because we don't know what the real mechanism is that's affecting the random number generator. We know there's an effect, or we know there's this correlation, but we don't know how it occurs. Is Is it the experimenters hoping for good data? Is it the other people in the area? Maybe they're using their precognition and they know when an RNG event is going to come up, so they report something. Is it do they have psychokinetic influence on the rest of their instruments? Is that is the shadow that moves across the wall actually something that's a PK phenomena from one of the researchers? There's just no way to tell. One of the things I like to play around with, and I know this probably makes hard-nosed physicists just roll their eyes, but I like to kind of think of it as maybe a ripple in what I call the probability field within a local proximity, the local area of the haunted house, because any paranormal event, when you think of it, is a highly, highly improbable event. It's an anomalous event. And so if there's a field, a probability field, and I'm using that in quotes because it's a metaphor really at this point, but if there is some kind of field in operation there, that improbability of an object moving on its own, or the improbability of a plane hitting a tower in New York, or the improbability of any of these things, might have an effect on a machine that sits there churning out numbers randomly so that its probability is thrown off the beam as well. And again, that's just, I once heard William Roll talk about in poltergeist phenomena, there was something he liked to refer to as a psi field that surrounded the poltergeist agent. And I don't know if this is the same thing or if it's two different things or not, but this is kind of the way I think about it conceptually in my mind, that the RNG and these paranormal events are both responding to a probability field within the vicinity, within the proximity of the haunted house, and that field suddenly changes when a ghost appears or an object moves or somebody has a paranormal experience. And both our researcher and our RNG both respond to the same thing at the same moment.
Yep, could be. I mean, Roll talked quite a bit about that, and it would make sense because a lot of times random number generators and other situations, when people don't know they're running, they still have an effect on them. So
Yes.
something happening where they're not, not focusing on the random number generator, and even in the, the paper we did, it seemed like when they weren't focused on it is when things happen. So it's more than just trying to influence the machine itself or the output. It has to do with something in the environment. And there's also this thing called the linger effect. So when things happen or they condition certain time and space, and Dean Radin has shown this, that there seems to be a linger effect. So there's something in the environment, or as you refer to it, the field, that something changes and it's being picked up by these things.
Yeah, and the reason I like to think of it in terms of field theory is that that immediately takes you beyond cause and effect. Like, I mean, if you think in most people know about gravitational fields. Well, you can't really meaningfully separate the gravitational field of the Earth, say, from the gravitational field of the moon. It's not like one causes the other, but they're both in relationship to one another, and they both obviously affect one another. And so I think we're maybe on a little bit, and one can also talk about the analogous idea of quantum entanglement, which again, any hard-nosed quantum mechanic person out there is going to be rolling their eyes, but there is at least the analogy that the two things seem to be connected to one another at a distance, and without having a cause and effect relationship to one another. And I think that's important.
Right.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, well, great. Thanks, Mike, for all the information. We've rapidly come up 1 hour mark, and I'm going to leave it to Matt if he has any last questions or any comments.
No,
And then
I I've actually been learning a lot from both of you guys because, like I said, this is out of my realm a little bit. I've done a couple of projects with Dave with random event generators, and just the work that you guys do just totally blows me away, and I'm really impressed with what both of you guys have been doing and getting involved with. I mean, the dedication that you guys take with this information is just beyond expressing words that I could come up with. But I commend you guys. You guys should really pat yourselves on the back for the work that you do.
Yes, and
um
I want to thank Dave so much for his willingness to be involved in this, for his willingness to do the initial analyses on the raw data that I sent him, and it's really important to have an independent researcher, because he's not directly a part of our team, who evaluates these kind of things with a critical eye and can come back and ask important questions about it. So
yeah.
Dave, thank you so much for being a part of this.
And I appreciate the opportunity to look into this with you. It's really exciting. I enjoy it. And I love the openness that you bring to the field and the willingness to, not just ask the tough questions, but try to answer them as well and be open about it. I think we need more of that. And, I'd like to
Yeah.
thank Matt for the opportunity to discuss this on the show, as well as, the invite I had to work with him at the time when we were out east. And, we had some good times out there. And I think the paranormal community could learn a lot from this, being open and doing some real scientific research.
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. Mike, I want to give you the floor to let our listeners and viewers know how can they reach you. You guys have any events that you'd like to share real quick that you're getting involved with at all, or how can they get in touch with you? What's your website information?
Right. Probably the best way to contact me is just through Facebook. And I'm just Mike Nichols on Facebook. And there are several of us. So look for the picture with a guy holding a guitar in his hand, because I used to play and sing in a band. Several people have said it looks like a CD cover. But once you find that, you know you've got the right Mike Nichols. And just contact me on there if you would.
Cool. Well, again, it's been an honor to have you on the show. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank
Uh,
you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
yeah,
And I
I
told Dave
mean,
we were going to just have a geek festival tonight, on being able to do these statistics and stuff. So
yeah.
it's been
I mean,
wonderful.
if we had a 5-hour show, we could go on for 5 hours with this stuff. I mean, we can just,
Easily.
yeah,
Yeah.
easily,
Thanks for
But
having me on, Matt. This has been really great.
yeah, no, it has, and I hope our audience can learn a little bit as well. I mean, that's what our show is kind of all about too.
I wanted to talk about books. Do we have time?
Oh yeah, yeah. Go
Oh,
ahead.
both Dave and I have talked about and lamented the fact that a lot of paranormal investigators today seem to be interested in the history of parapsychology, but don't really know much about it. And I thought maybe I would throw out a couple of book titles for any of them who really do want to read about the
Sure.
history of parapsychology, because this goes back to the founding of the Society for Psychical Research in 1882 back at Trinity College, Cambridge. So, so as far as modern scientific, the scientific approach applied to some of these questions. So I think if you are interested in the people who got this field of parapsychology, which was then called psychical research, off the ground, probably my favorite book on that topic would be by Alan Gauld, and it's called The Founders of Psychical Research. That's for people who like history and biography, because it really takes you into the headspace, into the minds of the people who got this field off the ground to begin with. Have you read that one, Dave?
Yes, yeah, that's a good one.
Also, a more later review, I guess you would say, but also covering those early years, I would suggest The Roots of Consciousness by Jeffrey Mishlove. And another one with a very similar title, The Roots of Coincidence by Arthur Kestler, who, of course, was the person who, and he's a historian of science himself, and he was the one who endowed the chair of parapsychology at the University of Edinburgh. So
Yeah, those
either
are
any of those would be good. Do you have any favorites, Dave?
If you're looking to get a general overview of parapsychology, I would do an introduction to parapsychology by Carolyn Watt and Harvey Irwin. If you want to look at apparitions, there's a book called Apparitions by Meyer Terrell. And then the Handbook of Parapsychology, there's an older one from 1977, and then there's a new one that just went out. I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago under the same title. And one of the ones I've always referred to as Hauntings and Poltergeists, a Multidisciplinary Perspective edited by James Horan and Rents Lange. Those are all good. They have a good historical component to them, but they also give you a really good up to the date where the field is as of today.
Awesome.
Great. Before we close out our show here with our viewers and our listeners, I just want to let everybody know that we changed back to Sunday afternoons or Sunday nights. I think we're gonna maybe switch back and forth from either 3 p.m. or 7 p.m. But for now, we're gonna stick with 7 p.m. on Sunday nights Eastern time. I know for you guys, I think you guys are an hour behind, right? Hour or 2 hours behind.
Yep, 1 hour.
Yeah. And then of course 3 hours over in Pacific time. But anyway, yeah, we're back on Sunday nights. So trust me, it wouldn't interfere with The Walking Dead if you're a Walking Dead fan. You got plenty of time. You got plenty of time for that. So, but anyway, guys, I had a great time. It was a great show. You know, again, thank you, Mike, for taking the time on your Sunday night to join me and Dave.
My pleasure.
You know, it was great. It was a great conversation, and I hope everybody learned a lot. I know I did. And you know, again, you know, there's just never enough time to learn, you know, any of this. So you need a lot more time. But you know, I appreciate the time that both of you guys gave us tonight. So
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks,
yeah,
Matt.
no problem. Yeah, and even if nobody asks questions during the show, if you have a question after the show, you want to watch the show later, it's on our YouTube channel. You know, feel free to email us, Fifth Dimension Radio Show at gmail.com. Ask us questions on our Facebook page about the episode. You know, we can relay messages back and forth to our guests if they don't mind. We can just shoot questions to them. You know, whether it be Dave or Mike Nichols. You know, either way, we'll reach out to them and hopefully get your answer to them. You know, to our listeners and our viewers. So, and we want to thank them too. You know, thank for taking the time to listen to our show. So, with that said, Dave, anything else?
Nope. Thanks again to Mike. Thanks, Matt. And everybody have a good night. And again, send any questions in and we'll get them answered for you. So thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
All right.